right, so we are good to go. So what we're going to do today is we're going to finish up our look at our special topic of ecological psychology. So we're a little bit behind on the syllabus. I'll tweak things as we go along. I'm going to see if I have enough ego to keep my own work in the syllabus, or we're going to have to sacrifice that. But whatever, we'll make sure that we keep it going. But I do want to give ecological psychology the time that it needs in order to cover it properly. So we're going to continue on today and then just see what we do with the rest of the schedule. But as for today, we're going to have a brief, really quick recap of the first parts of ecological psychology, the basics of it. What is this new approach or innovative approach all about? We're going to just re-go over the idea of texture, a very important aspect of ecological psychology. And then we're going to delve into the new stuff, the idea of the ambient optic array, the idea of the fact that the ambient optic array has two forms of structure, one being perspective and one being invariant or unchanging structure. And then we're going to end with a look at affordances, these action potentials that are present in our environment. All right, so just to recap, ecological psychology started with the starting point, the starting idea that we are organisms in an environment, and the goal of perception, the point of perception, the reason we have perception is not so we can have sensations, it's not so we can have mental sensations that we can experience, it's to guide adaptive action. The only reason we have a system that can perceive the environment is so we can move through that environment and interact with that environment, take action on that environment. And because of that, the ecological framework is tied very closely to the idea of an organism in an environment. So you can see the bottom one, the bottom point for ecological psychology is that it's active, right? You can't have activity without an organism. So when we were dealing with the physics framework, you can have physics even if humans do not exist in this universe. The laws of physics would still be the laws of physics. You cannot have perception unless there is something that is perceiving, unless there's an organism. And you can't have perception unless an organism is in something that can be perceived, which is environment. So the idea of this passive universe that worked so well for physics just wasn't good enough or fit with the way that psychology needed to think about perception. So James Gibson came up with the idea that perception is active, it's tied to an organism in an environment. That environment is not a mathematical formula, it's not an idealized physics model, but it's a real thing that can be a medium, things that we can move through, substances, things that are made up of stuff, and then surfaces, places where a medium and a substance or a substance and another substance interact. And what we perceive are these surfaces in a medium. And that's very important, as we're going to see later on, the fact that it's in a medium. So one of the kind of first things that this allows us to do is it allows us to identify what's important in perception, what could potentially be crucial in perception. And one of the first things that came across was the idea of texture. So texture is that idea that everything in our world, everything in our environment is not an idealized mathematical structure or model. So this is a mathematical model of a wall. This is what a real wall actually looks like. And when we went to the mathematical model, because we were using the physics framework, we actually stripped away all the details, all the important information that our perceptual system was designed to access, that our perceptual system was designed to use. We got rid of the texture. And the texture is so very important, and it's because it's part of our environment, it's part of everything in our environment. So this is where we ended last time, just the idea that everything has texture, everything has this sort of regular pattern to it. And even if it's not all the same, on average, it's the same, right? So the tiles over here, on average, are about the same size as the tiles over here. And then we have man-made textures, we have naturally occurring textures in rocks, and they follow patterns that your mind can pick up. And they have direct information that your mind can directly pick up. So sunflowers in a field, those are units of texture, and your mind can analyze different areas of your visual scene, take a look at the units of texture in those scenes, and come to the conclusion, come to the direct perception that this area is closer to us, this area is farther away, and the texture is what gives you that information. And the reason that perception had a hard time and needed a lot of top-down theories in order to understand how we, or try to understand how we perceive the world, is because when you were dealing with a physics model, an idealized model, all that information was gone. So the information that we were accessing wasn't part of what we were analyzing. So physics had a hard time explaining how do you perceive distance, but as soon as you realize we're not living in an idealized mathematical model, we are living in a real world. The real world provides the information, and one of the sources of that is texture. All right, so that catches us up from where we were last time. Now we're going to talk about another important aspect of ecological psychology, and this is the idea of the ambient optic array. So the ambient optic array, 3 parts to that: ambient, optic, and array. So we'll start off with the array portion. The array portion of this ambient optic array simply means that this concept, this thing that we're talking about, has an arrangement. It has a structure. It has a sort of shape to it. Ambient, and that's ambient at a point, that just means that it surrounds every point in the environment. So every point in the world that we live that could be occupied by an observer has an ambient optic array around that point. So this point at the end of my finger has an ambient optic array. This point has an ambient optic array. This point has an ambient optic array surrounding it in our environment. And the reason for this is because light is ambient. Light is everywhere around. So we have array, we have ambient, and then the last one is that this is optic. So this is what we use for visual perception. So when we perceive the world, what we're doing is we are accessing information given to us by the ambient optic arrays that exist in our environment. And this idea of ambience, this idea that there is an ambient optic array at every point in our environment, is the reason why when you walk through your environment never disappears, right? If there wasn't this array everywhere that we went, the environment could potentially flash in and out of your perceptual experience. But because this optic array is everywhere, it's ambient, everywhere that we can be, it can be, we get this perception of that environment. So this all comes from the fact that light is ambient, light is everywhere, and this is tied directly to the fact that, once again, we don't live in an idealized physics model. We live in a real environment, and our real environment has a medium, and that medium is air, and that is important. Why is it important? Because it creates this ambient optic array. So here we have light coming from, for example, the sun. So light's coming from the sun, and this is directional radiation. So each one of these lines can be thought of as a ray of light coming down. And this is direct radiation from the sun. It's traveling in straight lines and parallel straight lines. And then what happens is that if there was no medium that this light was going through, it would continue its path. It would continue its straight line path. But we don't live in a medium-free environment. We live in an environment that's full of air. And those airs are full of particles. And those particles reflect the light. So they scatter the light. They reflect the light. That's what's happening when you see a sunrise, right? Different light wavelengths are getting scattered in different ways, which is why you don't see the whole color of the sun. You see the reds and the purples. So this is happening in our environment. It's getting spread everywhere. And then that diffuses it. It hits objects, reflects off of those objects, hits air, reflects off of that air, and goes all over the place until the entire area is filled with light. The entire area is filled with light, means that there is an ambient optic array coming to every single area in our environment. And this reality of the world that we live in, this was one of the major challenges when computer animation first began. So when computer animation first began, they needed a way of modeling light. They needed a way of saying, all right, we have a lamp over here. What's the room going to look like? And the fact that each ray of light reflects and diffuses into 100 different directions, and then each one of those reflects and diffuses into 100 different directions, and then each one of those reflects and diffuses in hundreds of different directions, meant that there literally needed to be hundreds of millions of calculations being done to make light look realistic, and that was one of the major challenges to make a realistic looking computer simulation. So, give you another example of what this means for us. Oh, and you can see Gibson 1979 right down there. It's important to know the year. So, given this idea, what is ambient versus directional radiation? What would it look like? So this is as close as I could come to a sort of illustration of this. This is a picture of the Mona Lisa. That's what she would look like under ambient light. And under ambient light, you can tell that the light source, because of the shadows, is coming from this direction. And when it hits certain things, when it hits her hands, it bounces up. When it hits her chin, it bounces down. So it bounces all over here. And this is the illumination that occurs for this particular picture. If she was being drawn by Da Vinci in directional radiation light, that's what she would have looked like. So if there was no other light that was bouncing off other areas, then anything that was directly in the path of the light would be lit. Anything that was not would be 100% in shadow. So all of this area here was directional and lit by the light, but anything else would not have that light bouncing off, and we would live in a very, very different world, and it would look very, very different to us. So we live in an environment where there is this ambient light, and once again, Gibson said, that's the environment that we live in. How could we possibly use that information? So every position is surrounded by this ambient optic array. So therefore, any position that an observer finds himself in is also surrounded by that ambient optic array, and we can see everywhere because it's all surrounded. We have that information. All right. So that's the idea that the information is accessed and accessible everywhere in our environment. The array is what that information is. What are we actually accessing? And this array, again, we call it an array because the information that we're accessing from our environment has a shape. It has an arrangement. So it is structured by the environment. So the ambient optic array is made up of the light that is reaching our eye. And the light that is reaching our eye, the shape of that prism of light that is reaching our eye, that cone of light that is reaching our eye, the shape of it is determined by the environment. It's structured by the environment. That's what gives it that array. So what do we mean by structured? Well, if we were living in a world where there was unstructured an ambient optic not array, if there was an unstructured ambient optic thing, this is what it would look like. We live in a world where there's structure, so this is what it looks like. And to have structure simply means that certain areas of your array will be shaped differently than other areas. So here we have area A, and here we have area B. And notice area B, exactly the same as area A, right? There's no structure. There's no array here. On the other hand, in the real world, here we have area A, and here we have area B. Notice area A, mostly black. Area B, mostly white. Very different structure. We have structure in the environment. We have an array. So this situation here, it's always interesting to see when you take a look at these insights, how often certain things happen in the real world and how rare things like this are. So the only time this ever really happens to us in the real world is if you are in a very, very heavy fog where the light is being scattered by the fog immensely, then this would be the case for that. This would be you in a very, very heavy fog, and that very rarely ever occurs. This is you, basically 99.9999% of your life. So we have this structured array. What does that mean? Well, it means the following. It means that there is information at any point that is being structured and created by the environment that can then give you information about the environment. So here we have an example of an ambient optic array. So that is a position in the environment, that point right there. And this array here, this circle, is being structured by the environment around it. I almost feel like if I stop, it'll stop interrupting me, but why am I even thinking that? Okay, so notice this tree over here, right? This tree reflects light in this area here, structures this portion of the ambient optic array. The trunk structures this portion of the ambient optic array. The blue ground here structures this portion. The gazebo structures this portion of the array. This bird structures that portion of the array. The environment structures the points of the array. And if you move in the environment, the array changes. There's different structures at different points in the environment. Notice that the blue got much smaller, right? The yellow got much smaller and changed position. The green actually got bigger and changed position. The brown completely disappeared, right? The trunk is now completely obscured and doesn't have any portion of the ambient optic array. And that change in the optic array is what is that idea of a structure. It's structured by the environment around it. I'll give you one more visual of this. Here we have a tiled floor, and let's say that on that floor we had a tree, we had a person walking their dog, and we had a lamppost, and we got a point here, and at that point we're going to have an ambient optic array. And what it looks like the cone from each object that would be made if that object was the base of the cone, right? So if you took this tree and you built a cone from that tree and had it the same shape as the base of the cone was the same shape as the tree, that's what the structured light looks like. So we get a cone from the tree, we get a cone to that point from the dog walker, we get a cone to that point from the lamp, and if we have an observer at that point, they have access to this structured array. They have access to these cones of light that have been made by the environment that lets us directly pick up what our environment is like. All right, any questions on that so far? All right. So the ambient optic array, we talked about this structure. It actually has two types of structure, which are extremely important. These two components work together to allow us to perceive the world that we live in. The first structure is called perspective structure, and then the second structure that underlies it, complements it, is called invariant structure. So we're going to start with perspective structure, because you probably heard that word before. And this is what specifically determines the shape of your ambient optic array. Perspective geometry is what determines what those cones of light are going to look like when they reach that point in your eye. So it's literally just the geometry that determines what the shape of everything is. So it determines that light that is entering your eye. Perspective structure is what determines how big and where this slice of blue is going to be. It determines how big and where this slice of yellow is going to be, depending upon the position of the gazebo. It determines how big and where this slice of black is going to be for this bird over here. And it does that for every point in the environment. It determines how big and where that cone of light is going to be in this ambient optic array. So it is what we have coming into our vision at any point in our environment. So again, these shapes, they are determined by the perspective structure of this ambient optic array. And as this observer moves through their environment, you'll notice that the perspective structure changes. So perspective geometry requires that those cones change as your person moves through the environment. And if they move forward, they change. If they move backward, they change. If they move to the left, to the right, they change. They change as you move through your environment. So one of the big questions that psychologists and perceptual researchers were trying to answer, and a lot of research was poured into, is that if the information coming to your eye is changing as you move through the environment, why do you not perceive the environment as changing? Right? So as you go closer to this dog walker, the angle here of this cone gets larger and larger. So why is it that as you walk closer to that dog walker, he does not look like he grows in size? The information coming to your eye is occupying a larger and larger piece of that pie. So why is it that you don't say to yourself, oh my gosh, this dog walker is getting huge, and then I walk away and, oh, the dog walker is shrinking, and then I come back and it's like, oh, the dog walker is huge. Why is it that we don't have that perceptual experience? Why do we have perceptual constancy? That as we move through the world and things change and these angles change and this perspective structure changes, why is it that we don't perceive the world as changing? That has to do with the second form of structure, and this was one of the huge insights, invariant structure. So invariant structure, this is the structure of the optic array that does not change. It's there right in the name, it's invariant. It does not change when that point of observation changes. So it is the part of the array that stays invariant. It is the relations in the array that stay invariant. It's the pieces of it that stay unchanging. And that invariant structure is what underlies our perception of an unchanging world. That invariant structure is why, as I move through this classroom, people do not look like they're changing size. That invariant structure is why, as I go closer or further away, people don't look like they're shrinking or growing. It underlies the perspective structure. So it's easy to see the fact that the perspective structure changes as you move. It's a little bit more challenging, and this is one of the big challenges for ecological psychologists, to figure out what doesn't change, right? What doesn't change about the ambient optic array as you move through this environment, and that's where we get into the idea of these invariants. So let's give you an example. One of the big ideas, or one of the big first invariants that was proposed, and there's a lot of research that showed that this is a very important invariant for perception, is units of texture on the ground. So the number of units on the texture of a ground that a object covers is an invariant relation in the ambient optic array. So that could be one of the reasons why, as you move objects through your world, or as you get closer to objects, they do not perceive to be growing in size or shrinking in size, because their relation to that texture on the ground is not changing. It's invariant. So let's take a look at what this might look like. So here we once again have our grid of tiles on a ground plane. And tiles are often used to illustrate these principles because it's very easy to count them. They form basically a grid of your environment. So let's say that we have a can and it's sitting there on the ground. We can perceive that that can has a certain size. If we see another can off in the distance, we can immediately see that those two cans are the same size. And one of the reasons why is because they have an invariant relation to the ground that they're standing on. So you'll notice that this can over here, the base of that can covers 2 tiles. It covers 2 units of texture. It is 2 tiles wide. This can over here covers 2 tiles, 2 units of texture. It's also 2 tiles wide. So the fact that we see this can as being the same size as this can has to do with the fact that the invariant relation of how many tiles are you covering, 2 over here and 2 over here, is exactly the same. And if we add another can and it also covers 2 tiles, we once again perceive it as being the same width as these other three cans. These other two cans. And that works for cans that are within your environment. That's one of the reasons why if you look around this room and you see all these chairs, they all seem to be the same size. And it also works if you're moving through an environment. So if you start walking closer to this can, the can will always cover those 2 units of texture. It doesn't matter if the can is far away. It doesn't matter if the can is very, very close. It will cover those 2 units of texture regardless of where that can is on that ground. So as you move closer or further, it doesn't seem to be shrinking or expanding because your mind is picking up the fact that it's covering those 2 units of texture. Your mind is picking up that invariant, and that is why you directly perceive that can is staying exactly the same size. Any questions on the ground plane units of texture? All right. So I was talking about physics and how we can't use idealized frameworks. And this tile ground plane is a highly idealized framework. So before we leave this idea of units of texture, I just want to show you this also works in the real world. So in the real world, in natural environments, the ground plane is typically what is called stochastically random. And what stochastically random means is that even though things are random at all points in this environment, you can see here, this rock is not the same as this rock. This is not like tiles on a ground plane where everything is the same. This rock is bigger than this rock is smaller than this rock. There's all different sizes of rocks. The rock sizes are random. However, they have the same randomness over here as they do over here. And they have the same randomness over here as they do over here. So the rocks over here in general are no bigger or smaller than the rocks over here. The rocks over here in general are no bigger or smaller than the rocks over here. And you'll see this in fields of sunflowers, all different sizes, but the sunflowers in one part of the field are the same typical average size as other parts of the field. Fields of grass, you'll see this in the road outside. If you're going on a gravel road, the gravel in one part is pretty much the same size as gravel in the other part. So it's stochastically random. And what that means is, once again, if you have that object, it will cover a certain number of rocks on that ground. And that number of rocks will stay pretty much the same regardless of how close or how far away that object is in this environment. So once again, we have this idea of texture existing in the real world, and that texture scales our perception of the environment. So the fact that the texture is maintained means that we can see and perceive the world as being unchanging in variant. All right, so any questions on that analysis? All right, so one last thing I'm going to mention about this is how important it is that we understand that our perception is directly tied into the environment. Specifically, our perception is developed to take advantage of the environment that we live in. Are you guys trying to get those down? I know there's a way. There's a switch around here somewhere. Yeah, I hate it with sunlight. I don't want to test something in there if it turns off. Let's try it. Green lines. Oh, I can put them up. I can't actually put them down. All right, we tried. That's the lowest they go. Okay, so speaking of the environment that we live in. So the environment that we live in is very important that we live in this world because this is the world where we developed our perceptual system. Our perceptual system developed to interact with this world. It's tied directly to this world. And one of the things that we have in this world is gravity. And that's very important to our perceptual system. Because if you take a look at this red cylinder over here, you can see that this red cylinder is the same size as this cylinder, it's the same size as this cylinder, because that red cylinder covers 2 units, this cylinder covers 2 units, this cylinder covers 2 units, and regardless of where that red cylinder goes, it covers 2 units. This only works when things are on the ground. This is the only time when this unit of texture can be used to scale objects. Because if I put a shadow under that cone, and you realize that it's flying in space, all of a sudden it's just floating in midair, all of a sudden you perceive it and it's smaller, right? That is a small cylinder now. And as it moves closer to this, to this cylinder over here, it's apparent that, yeah, it is very, very small. So it is important that we live in a world with gravity, and it's important that we live in a world where most things don't float. So if you take a look around this room, once again, we did this when we were talking about face perception, and I was like, look at all the faces in this room. If you take a look at things around this room, there's nothing floating in this room. Everything is either on the ground, you're on the ground, I'm on the ground, or it's on something that is attached to the ground. So my cup is not on the ground, but it's on a table. That table is on the ground. That projector is not on the ground, but it's attached to a ceiling, that's attached to a wall, that's attached to the ground. Everything in here is attached to the ground. And it is amazing how hard it is to perceive things when they're not attached to the ground. So one example of this, we'll just take it from popular culture. One example of this is if you ever go scuba diving, it's hard to judge distance when you're in the ocean and you can't see the ground because you got no texture, you got nothing to base your perception on. So this is what they had in that scene in Finding Nemo when they were going to ask that small little fish for directions on how to get to Sydney, and then as they got closer, they realized it wasn't a fish, and it ended up being a whale, and then Dory was like, I can speak whale, right? Everybody remember that? So the reason that it looked like a small fish was because they didn't have that ground plane, they didn't have that texture, they couldn't scale it. So they didn't have that information that it was a small fish close to them or a large fish farther away because they didn't have those units of texture. In the real world, you'll experience this. Anytime you see a flock of birds, try to judge the distance of that flock of birds, and your distance will oftentimes be way off, and you can tell when they fly in front of something or they fly behind something. So I've often thought that birds were far away, they're flying around, and all of a sudden they fly in front of a building, and I realize, oh, they're close. Or I think they're closer, and then they fly behind a building, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're far away. I never have trouble judging the distance of birds when they land on the ground, because I have that texture, I got that ground plane. Put them in the air, much, much more difficult, because we don't have that invariant relation. All right, so that's one possible invariant. And this is, we sort of saw the importance there of active perception, so let's make it explicit right now. One of the ways that you discover what's invariant is by actually moving through your environment. So when you move through your environment, when you're in a static position, if one of my hands here, this is the perspective structure of the ambient optic array, and this is the invariant structure. When you're static, those two are like right on top of each other. But as you move, it's like you separate them, and you can start to see what's invariant and what's the perspective structure. So, for example, just to kind of give you a hypothetical here, if I asked you to describe what is the relation between these two dots here, these two circles here, compared to the line. So what is their relation compared to the line? Without motion, it can be 100 different relations, right? They're equidistant from the line, they're equidistant from each other, they're always this far from the line. There's 100 different relations that could be here. But as soon as you put in motion, then it's very apparent what the relation is. In this case, they are always equidistant from each other, regardless of how far away they are from the line. And that becomes massively apparent as soon as you move, as soon as things start moving in the environment. In another case, the relation is that they are always the same distance from the line. And once again, that only becomes apparent once things start moving in an environment. So it's important that we're active in our environment, because that's oftentimes where we get these invariants, oftentimes where we can find out this invariant structure. And you'll know this, and you've intuitively done this, if you ever look at something and it's difficult to see or it's difficult to judge, what is something that oftentimes people do if they're trying to look at something and it's difficult to judge and they're trying to get a better look? What do? They squint their eyes. What's another strategy? Saw one person do it. They'll move. They'll literally sit there and they'll be like, what is that? Let me see. Let me think. What could that possibly be? They'll do that. They'll physically start moving around the environment to try to take that perspective structure and tear it away from the invariant structure. So if you've ever looked at something off into the distance and you thought to yourself, like I'm doing it right now, if you thought to yourself, what is that? I can't quite, what is that thing over there? What is going on? What you're doing is you're taking action in your environment, trying to get that perspective structure separated from that invariant structure. All right, so the rest of today, we're going to take a look at a few more examples of invariance, and then we're going to talk about affordances. So let's do those invariants right now. So there's invariance in principle. Anything that you perceive as unchanging has an invariant structure that's underlying that. So if you perceive anything that is unchanging, or anything that you can kind of, so I'll just stick with that. Anything that you perceive as unchanging, you can, there's an invariant that underlies that. One of the things is observer position, all right? It's kind of hard to think of that as being invariant, but you are always where you are. True? You're never anywhere else except where you are. You know, let's not get philosophical here. But anyways, you're always in your position, and you always kind of know where you are in the world, right? You always kind of know the position that you are, the relation that you are to other things. And that's because invariant relations underlie where you are in the world. So observer position has an ambient optic array invariant structure that specifies where that position is. So we'll take a look at a simplified example of this, and we'll take a look at a road. So here we have the ground, here we have the sky, and here we have my drawing of a road going off into the distance. I'm going to show you a few examples. And all I want you to do is to put up your hands and answer for any particular structure that you see up here. Are you off the road in that case? Or is that what would happen if you were on the road? Okay, so that's the only question that you need to answer, is that if you were seeing what is going to be placed up on the screen, are you seeing that because you're off the road and you are safely walking to your destination? Or are you on the road and you're in danger of getting run over? All right, so let's go right hand up if you're off the road, left hand if you're on the road. There's number one. So right hand if you're off, left hand if you're on. All right, see mostly right hands. How about that one? Left hand if you're on, right hand if you're off. Did I get that backwards? All right. All right. How about that one? Left hand if you're on the road, right hand if you're off. All right, so everybody seems to basically be in agreement. How about this one? It's a thinker, little on the borderline. Okay, most of you got that one correct as well. So the reason that you're able to answer those questions, even with this really impoverished stimuli here, is because there's an invariant relation that tells you if you're on the road or if you're off the road. So in our world, we have, once again, that perspective structure. And if you have two parallel lines, like the edges of a road, going off into the distance, they're going to conclude at a vanishing point. They're going to converge to a vanishing point. And then you're going to have these two lines. And if one of these lines converges to one side and the other line converges to the other side, so if road edge number one is to the left of the vanishing point, like it is right here, right? All of road edge number one is to the left, and road edge number two is to the right. If that's the relation of the edges to the vanishing point, you are on the road. That's the invariant relation. So everybody put up their hands and said, yep, on the road, because road edge number one was to the left, road edge number two was to the right. For this example, everybody said off the road. We're safe, we're not getting run over. Why? Because road edge number one is to the right and road edge number two is to the right. So if both road edges are on one side, off the road. If one road edge is on one side, one road edge is on the other, on the road. And that is true every time you're on the road, one to the left, one to the right. Every time you're off the road, both on one side, in this case, both going off to the left. So the fact that we are very able to figure out when you're walking, am I on the road or am I off the road? The fact that we don't wander onto the road when we're walking. The fact that we can walk and keep our heads up and not have to do this when we're walking to make sure that we don't veer off into the road is because when we're walking, all we're doing is we're controlling the fact that both road edges that we see off in the distance, both of those are either to the left of the vanishing point or they're to the right of the vanishing point. All right, so that's another example of an invariant. Any questions on the road, off the road? All right, so these invariants, again, they're what provide information for perception. They're what let us know about the world that we're living in. They're that direct information that we pick up. And notice that they're not clues or heuristics or guesses. They're not anything that needs inferences. They don't need top-down processing. They can be very direct from the bottom up. Just directly from the bottom up, 2 edges to the left, you're off the road. 1 edge on each side, you're on the road. You don't have to engage in higher order thinking in order to answer these perceptual questions. So you can tell that ecological psychology is very bottom up. This is a very bottom up perceptual approach. So this is what's known as specification. That information specifies where you are. It doesn't give you hints of where you are. It specifies where you are. And as I mentioned before, anything that can be perceived that is persistent, according to ecological psychology, has an invariant lying underneath it. So we took a look at some really simple examples here just to kind of illustrate the point. Let's get into a little bit more complicated examples. So the first one here, just slightly, we'll push the complicated aspect of it, has to do with physical size. So I mentioned before that as you walk through the environment, things don't look like they're shrinking or growing. As somebody comes towards you, they don't look like they're becoming gigantic in size. And this has to do with a invariant relation. So once again, we got a road. And let's say that you said goodbye to your friend, the businessman, and he was walking away. And this is him as he begins to walk away. And a little bit later, there he is. And a little bit later, there he is. And later, all the way until he vanishes from sight. At no point will this individual look like they're shrinking. And the reason for that is because there's an invariant relation here that tells you exactly how tall this individual is. And it's called the horizon ratio relation. And the horizon ratio relation takes into account the fact that we have a horizon. So we live in a world where our world meets the sky, our substance meets a medium, that's the horizon. And as it happens, and if you're interested in the math, you can look up horizon ratio relation, but that's not important here. What is important is that if you take a look at this horizon, notice that when he's close, it intersects him right at the neck. That horizon intersects this upright individual right at the neck. And when he's farther away, that horizon intersects this individual right at the neck. And when he's farther away, that horizon intersects the individual right at the neck. And regardless of where he is standing in this world, that horizon will intersect that individual right at the neck. The ratio of what's above the horizon to what's below the horizon will remain invariant when this person is in this world. So as you go through, or they go through this world, you don't see them as growing or shrinking because that ratio does not change. And incidentally, right there is your eye height. So this person here, their eye height is at their neck is at your eye height. You can literally scale a person in terms of their eye height, units of eye height in terms of their height because of this relation. So your horizon is always at your eye height. And if you take a look at drawings by artists when they draw people, if they want to draw everybody, at a realistic height, they will put their eyes at the eye height of the horizon, closer or further away, depending upon how tall or short they are. But that relation will not change, ratio below to the ratio above. More complicated, and we're not going to get into the math of this, identity. The fact that people look the same, the fact that you can identify somebody, even if they change their hair, even if you haven't seen them in 4 years, right? The fact that you might have had a childhood friend that you hadn't seen in 10 years, and then you see them and you're like, oh my gosh, it's you, and you recognize them. The fact that identity does not perceive to change means that it's underlied by an invariant. And one of the best ways to illustrate this is to take a look at something where the perspective structure of a person's identity is absolutely destroyed, but their invariant structure remains intact, and that is the art of caricatures. So there we have. Okay, so does anybody know who this is? Will Smith. You call them out when you see them. All right, so this is Will Smith. All right, this is what Will Smith actually looks like. This is the perspective structure of Will Smith and the invariant structure of Will Smith. So this picture here preserves the perspective structure and the invariant structure. This character over here destroys the perspective structure, right? Those ears are way too big, right? This forehead, way too stretched out. The eyes, way too pinched in at the side, right? The perspective structure, completely gone. But the reason you can recognize this is because the caricature artist that drew this maintained the invariant structure. So whatever the relations were in this face, whatever those unchanging relations were that told you, yep, that's Will Smith, those are preserved over here. And that's why as soon as I put this up, hands went up and people were like, that's Will Smith, because the invariant structure is there, but perspective structure is completely gone. All right, another example. All right, so that's former President Barack Obama. And once again, this perspective structure destroyed, invariant structure maintained, and this is perspective and invariant structure. That's why it looks like a realistic picture. And I like this one because apparently Barack Obama has another invariant structure, which is the way that he tilts his head when he's mildly annoyed. So he always seems to go to the left, whenever he's not that happy. And I just wonder if like going to the right, like really means that he's angry at you. So if he's always like really, 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 you're like, okay, you're fine. But as soon as he's like, really, you're like, oh my gosh, oh no. But when I was looking for photos of him, honestly, most of them were like him, like that. And I'm just like, that must have been when Cheney really did something wrong. All right. And again, we have maintained invariant structure, completely lost perspective structure. So I didn't hear any call-outs. Thank you. All right. And sometimes it's kind of funny with caricatures. Sometimes you don't really have to go that far. So it's weird how almost photorealistic, Keith Richards' face there is. But again, it's that idea of destroying the perspective structure. So you can really get rid of the perspective structure. I mean, this is an example of where it's like absolutely destroyed. Anybody? Snoop Dogg, yep. And once again, there is the perspective and invariant structure. This is just invariant structure. And again, I mean, the list is endless. The caricatures are all there. But it works because the invariant structure is maintained. The invariant structure is preserved. And it's also fascinating as a psychologist, if you're interested in face perception, if you're interested in identity perception, or just perception in general, there are cases when somebody destroys their invariant structure and then they become very difficult to recognize. So I remember coming across this, and I did not know who that is until I read the description. And that's Zoe Deschanel. And I recognized her here, right? And I used to watch, she was on New Girl, was the show? Yeah. I love that one up until about like season 3 or 4. I think when Schmitty was awesome, it was great. But anyways, I recognize her 100% right here. I did not know who this is. And there is something about her identity. There's an invariant structure that is here that is gone here. So the loss of her bangs, there's something about those bangs that created the invariant structure. And if you cannot recognize her in the second picture, it means that your invariant structure for her face relied on those particular bangs. So we're going to take a look at a video example of this. So for those of you that remember Tom Selleck and Magnum PI, this is a video where somebody photoshopped Tom Selleck's mustache on a series of different celebrities. And just kind of make a mental note. And this is why I'm using an example. Make a mental note of how some of these celebrities, it's just immediate. You'll see them, you'll be like, oh, that's so-and-so with a mustache. And then other ones, it's hard. You're looking at them going, who is that? And it takes a while because this mustache, in some cases, preserves the invariant structure. It's just so-and-so with a mustache. In other cases, it destroys the invariant structure, and you're going to be sitting there going, who is that particular individual? All right, so again, some of those massively easy, super apparent. Other ones of those, you might have been sitting there going, oh my gosh, who is that? I know who it is, but I just can't see it. For some of those, the mustache maintained the invariance. For others, the mustache did not maintain the invariance. And I will just end this example with a real life anecdote of this, just to kind of show you. So I mentioned before that my supervisor was Dr. John Kennedy at the University of Toronto, and then his supervisor was Gibson. So Gibson's like my grand supervisor. And Dr. Kennedy, for most of the time that I knew him, had a mustache, right? So he had a mustache, and I'm talking like years, right? I did my master's with him, I did my PhD with him. So I was with him for years. And one day I walked into his office, and he started talking to me, and there was something about him, and I couldn't quite place it. And it was like, it wasn't immediately apparent. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, you shaved your mustache. Like his mustache was completely gone. And I'm not talking, he didn't have like a little pencil thin mustache. He had like a mustache. And he shaved it and it wasn't gone, and it wasn't apparent for the first little while. And he actually told me, he actually congratulated me. And he said that so many people did not notice. So many people did not mention it. They just didn't notice that he had shaved. What he was in effect saying was that the invariant relations for his identity, for whatever reason, did not include his mustache. His mustache was not something that was in that invariant identity relation. So when his mustache was gone, it was hard to recognize. It was hard to realize because the rest of the invariant structure that determined his identity was still there. So for me, he was still Dr. Kennedy. Nothing changed. And it really took a few moments before I was like, wait a second. Yes, something is different here, and that's that idea of that invariant identity. And invariance actually, anything that you can perceive that is stable, that doesn't change over time, has an invariant underneath it. So gender identities, right? If there is something that people perceive when they present as male versus present as female, that's an invariant. If you can take a look at somebody and say, that person presents as male, that's because they have an invariant structure to them that is communicating maleness. If you can take a look at your friend and know that they're angry, and know when they're happy, and know when they're sad, that's because they're projecting an invariant relation that is telling you, this is my emotion, this is my emotion, this is my emotion. And if you can do things like perceive nervousness, perceive happiness, perceive irritability, all of those are underlined by invariant structures. So we'll take a look at an example of that, and the link on this is in your lecture notes as well. So this is a point walker over here. And first off, just kind of mention this, this mimics biological motion. So we should all be able to see something that looks like somebody with lights on them walking in the dark. Is that, yep, okay, good. All right, so what we can do here is, they have these little sliders here. And you can change the way that this person walks. And if you can pick up the fact that this person just became bigger, that this is a larger individual that is walking, that means that there is something invariant about the way that heavy, large individuals walk. If you can tell that this person just got lighter, just got thinner, there's something invariant about the way that those individuals walk. If you can tell that this person here just got a little bit nervous and is a little bit uptight, whereas this person here is chill and relaxed and not at all worried about things. If you can pick that up, that means that there's an invariant relation that is underlying the fact that people who are relaxed walk in a certain way, people who are nervous walk in a certain way. People who are happy walk in a certain way. People who are sad walk in a different way. And if you can perceive the sadness, if you can perceive the happiness, what that means is that something is underlying. There's some invariant relation that is underlying that perception, that way of walking. That also means that all sad people tend to walk the same way. That doesn't mean that they walk exactly the same way, but the invariant structure of how a sad person walks is the same across individuals. The invariant structure of how a happy person walks, same across individuals. The invariant structure of how a nervous person walks, same across individuals. And if you ever come across somebody who's very difficult to read, if you ever come across somebody and you're like, I can't read you, are you happy, are you sad, I really just can't, pick it up. Basically what you're saying is you don't have that invariant. You don't have that invariant that I'm looking for. I can't pick up that information. All right, so that's invariance. Any questions on invariance before we get to our last kind of feature of ecological psychology, which is affordances? All right. So an affordance. So one of the last major contributions that Gibson made, and this is known as one of his more kind of out there creative ideas, I would say, is the idea of affordances. I love affordances, one, because I think there's a lot of psychological truth to affordances. Two, I love the way they're described, and you'll see what I mean in just a second. But affordances are action possibilities that are in your environment. So we take action on our environment. What that means is that we can perceive possibilities to take action in our environment. Our environment has perceptible action opportunities. So these action opportunities, they're objectively measurable. Just like in invariance, you can go out and you can measure the angles and the relations for invariance. You can measure these objectively measurable affordances, and they're independent of the individual's ability to actually recognize those affordances, so you don't have to recognize the fact that you can take action in order for the affordances to exist, and it is dependent upon the capabilities of the actor. You don't perceive something as being a possibility for action if you cannot take that action. Of course, there's different degrees to this ability to perceive correctly what sort of action you can take. And if you ever met somebody that thought they could dunk a basketball and then they're like 2 feet under the rim at best, you'll know that this is true. But in general, we can perceive what our capabilities are. So what is an affordance? Well, let's suppose that a surface is horizontal. Being horizontal is something that's objectively measurable, right? You can go to a surface, you can put a level on it, you can say this surface is horizontal. So that's objectively measurable. Flat is objectively measurable. So we have a surface that is horizontal, that is flat, that is extended. Extended just means that it has area, it has width, and it has length. It's rigid. Rigid is something that can be measurable. So for example, this table is rigid. And it's approximately knee-high off the ground. So it's right about knee-high off the ground. If a surface has those characteristics, then you pick up the affordance that surface is, and this is why I like affordances, that surface is sit-onable. So affordances are always ended with onables, or basically blankables. So that surface would be sit-onable. And that's why when you see something that looks like this, you don't really have to know that it's a chair to know that you can sit on that particular thing, because it is horizontal, it is flat, it is extended, it is rigid. It's approximately knee-high off the ground. That cube there might not be made for you to sit on, but you can immediately perceive, if you needed to, you can sit on that. And if you've ever sat on something that's not a chair, if you've ever thought to yourself, man, I'm really tired of walking, let me look around for something to sit on, what you've been doing is you've been saying to yourself, let me look around for something that is flat, extended, horizontal, approximately knee-high off the ground, and you'll sit on anything that will fit those categories, whether it's a rock, whether it's a bench, whether it's whatever, you perceive it as being sit-onable. If we have all of this, and that object is repeating, well, then you have something that is climb-upable. So stairs are climb-upable. Notice stairs are also sit-onable, right? You don't have to teach a child to sit on the stairs. They're not made for sitting, and yet you perceive that you can do that. So stairs are climb-upable. Those objects would be climb-upable. They are also crawl-upable, as anybody with young children will know, and you do not have to teach a child to crawl up the stairs. They will immediately perceive that they can crawl up those stairs. And notice, if you do take care of children, notice that they perceive this and it's direct. At a very young age, they will start crawling upstairs. They don't try to crawl up a wall, right? I've never met a child that's gone up to the wall and started doing this, really trying to crawl up the wall, because there's no affordance there. They know that the wall is not crawl-upable. They really know that, that the stairs are crawl-upable. Stairs are sit-onable, as I mentioned before. Stairs are fall-offable, right? People will, very young children, there's a very famous experiment called the visual cliff. Very young children will get to the edge of the stairs and they'll fall and they'll stop, because they'll realize, I can fall. They'll perceive the fall-offable. So Gibson, we'll end the affordances of this quick look. So Gibson, I love this quote. He goes, "Now, just as surfaces are stand-onable and sit-onable, so are they bump-intoable, get-underneathable, climb-onable, or fall-offable." So this is the idea of affordances in the environment. So that door is walk-underable. Those desks are sit-onable. This table is bang your knee and hurt your knee onable, right? I mean, these are all things. This over here is put your laptop onable. Anything that we take action on, this cup here is graspable. It is also liftable. It is drink fromable. These are all affordances that we perceive, that we directly get, once again, from that environment. So the concept of affordances kind of puts the final sort of star in this idea of ecological psychology. It shows that the environment is not just important for perception, but the environment actually is part of perception. So it's not just that we perceive the environment, but the environment is part of our perceptual process. We're organisms, that's the environment, we are tied directly to it. Another way to think of this is that there is no perception without the organism. If you have nothing to perceive, if you have no perceiver, you have no perception. There's no perception without the environment. If you have nothing to perceive, there's also no possibilities for perception. All right, any final questions on ecological psychology? All right, so that is it for today. So next class, we're still in our special topics area. So I'm going to make the decision. We're either going to start up on picture perception. I'm thinking about 90% sure of that. And then we'll see what we can do in terms of my own research. I do like to touch on that because it is a little bit of extra value for the course, but I'll figure that all out. We are done for this week, and have yourself a wonderful weekend.